The Mackinac Bridge didn't just break a world record, it made an entire way of traveling obsolete almost overnight. Before it opened in 1957, nearly 1 million vehicles a year were being forced through a ferry system that could leave families waiting for hours just to cross 4 miles of water. Then this enormous 5-mile bridge opened, and 34 years of ferry travel effectively disappeared in a single day. Since then, more than 200 million vehicles have crossed it. Today, this bridge in remote northern Michigan still carries more than 4.5 million vehicles every year, an extraordinary number for a crossing that doesn't feed New York, San Francisco, or any major city. It became the gateway to an entire American vacation region. But building it took more than 70 years of failed plans, an abandoned bridge attempt, a financial crisis, and engineering problems so extreme that Mackinac became one of the most remarkable suspension bridges ever built. And its biggest surprise came afterward. The bridge that destroyed one beloved American travel ritual became an even bigger ritual itself. So how did 4 miles of water create one of America's greatest bridges and permanently change what going up north meant for generations of families? Why the Straits mattered. Start with the absurd problem Michigan had to solve. The state's two halves could sit only 4 miles apart and still be separated by hours. Michigan is famously split into 2 great peninsulas divided by open water. The lower peninsula, the Mitten, held the farms, the factories, Detroit, and most of the people. The upper peninsula held almost everything they wanted. It didn't start that way. When Michigan entered the Union in 1837, it received the Upper Peninsula as a consolation prize in a border dispute with Ohio, a frozen, roadless wilderness swapped for the city of Toledo, and plenty of politicians considered it a bad trade. Then surveyors found copper, then iron, then loggers found white pine forests that seemed to have no end. The worthless consolation prize turned out to contain some of the richest mineral country on the continent. And when the mines and the timber began to fade, the Upper Peninsula revealed its final treasure, the one that would matter most to ordinary families. It was beautiful. Waterfalls, painted sandstone cliffs rising out of Lake Superior, trout streams, deer in numbers that drew hunters from 3 states every November. Cabins on lakes nobody downstate had heard of. And at the doorway between the peninsulas, Mackinac Island, a Victorian resort island where automobiles were banned, and the Grand Hotel's front porch ran longer than 2 football fields. Everything Americans wanted was on the other side. And between all of it and the majority of Michigan's population sat just 4 miles of water, 4 miles that could behave like an ocean. The Straits of Mackinac are cold, deep, and restless, the place where Lake Michigan and Lake Huron pour into each other. Wind funnels through the gap. Storms build fast. In winter, the Straits freeze into shifting plates of ice thick enough to stop ships. 4 miles. A healthy person can walk 4 miles in an hour. And for most of Michigan's history, those 4 miles might as well have been 400. The stranger part is that Americans started dreaming about bridging them before the automobile even existed. The dream, the 1880s. The Mackinac Bridge was such an outrageous idea that Americans began proposing it when the Brooklyn Bridge itself was still a technological sensation. In 1884, a Grand Rapids newspaper floated the idea of spanning the Straits at a moment when the longest bridges on Earth were still front-page miracles. The Brooklyn Bridge had opened only the year before, and it had changed something in the American imagination. If you could hang a roadway over the East River, what exactly was impossible anymore? 4 years later, the idea acquired a very expensive endorsement. In 1888, at a meeting of the Grand Hotel's board on Mackinac Island, Cornelius Vanderbilt, a member of one of the most famous transportation dynasties in American history, declared that what the region truly needed was a bridge across the Straits. One of the richest men in the country could already see the problem plainly. Even Vanderbilt money and Vanderbilt influence couldn't make the bridge happen. It still wouldn't exist for nearly 70 more years. The dreamers didn't stop at a bridge. Over the following decades, proposals arrived that read like dares: a floating tunnel submerged in the Straits, and a 24-mile chain of bridges and causeways hopscotching across islands, entering the Upper Peninsula from an angle no traveler would ever actually want. When people are proposing a 24-mile detour to cross a 4-mile gap, you know the normal solutions have already failed. Each scheme was a measure of the same desperation. People were willing to consider almost anything rather than accept that 4 miles of water would divide Michigan forever. The solution Michigan chose instead looked far more practical. It would also become so successful that it created an even bigger problem. The ferries, a solution that created its own problem. Michigan's first real solution worked brilliantly, which is exactly why it eventually became impossible to live with. By the early 1920s, the automobile had changed the question entirely. It was no longer a matter of freight and railroads. Ordinary families owned cars now, and ordinary families wanted to drive north, all the way north. The private boat operators at the Straits couldn't handle them, sir. So in 1923, the state of Michigan did something almost no state had done. It went into the ferry business itself. The first state vessel, the Little Ariel, began shuttling automobiles across the Straits. In its first season, it carried around 10,000 cars. Problem solved. Except that it wasn't, because the ferries didn't just serve the traffic to the Upper Peninsula, they created it. Every year the crossing got easier. More families decided the trip was worth making. The state added a bigger boat. Traffic grew faster. It added another. Traffic grew faster still. And the growth wasn't gradual, it was runaway. By its final year of operation, a service that had begun with roughly 10,000 automobiles was trying to move around 900,000 of them. The ferries weren't failing. America was simply producing road traffic faster than boats could absorb it. Most days, the system actually worked. It was the peaks that broke it: deer season, holiday weekends, the first hot Saturday of summer, when a fleet built to hold roughly 500 cars at once met lines that could run into the thousands. At the worst moments, the line waiting to cross 4 miles of water could stretch 16 miles down the highway. A 4-mile crossing. A 16-mile line of cars. The crossing had become a victim of its own popularity, and it wasn't only vacationers paying the price. The Upper Peninsula lived on the far side of that bottleneck year-round. Its businesses, its produce trucks, its residents heading downstate, all of it metered through a handful of boat ramps and the moods of Great Lakes weather. When ice choked the Straits or storms held the boats at the dock, half of Michigan effectively went off the map. The ferries solved Michigan's crossing problem. They also created the argument that would eventually kill them. But before we watch that world die, we should spend a moment inside it. Because for everyone who lived it, the ferry line wasn't a statistic. It was a place. The lost world of the ferry line. Picture the northbound line on a cold November morning in the early 1950s. Deer season has opened, and the hunters of the Lower Peninsula are migrating. The line of cars begins at the dock in Mackinac City and runs back through town, past the last gas station, and out along the highway, sedans and pickups and wood-paneled wagons, exhaust drifting in the cold, deer rifles cased in back seats, and here and there, a buck lashed to a fender heading the other way. Nobody is going anywhere for a while, so the line becomes a kind of settlement. Engines tick as they cool. Men in wool coats stand in clusters, stamping their feet. Children escape from back seats and chase seagulls along the shoulder. Vendors work their way down the rows of cars, selling hot pasties, the miner's meal of the Upper Peninsula, beef and potato and rutabaga folded in pastry, and travelers eat them off the hoods of their cars while the gulls hang overhead, waiting for crumbs. Somewhere ahead, a ferry horn sounds, and a few hundred feet of the line shuffles forward, and then everything settles back into waiting. Out on the water, the boats crawl back and forth, diesel smoke, loading ramps clanging, deckhands waving cars forward inch by inch until the vessel is packed like a parking garage that floats. And across the Straits, visible the entire time, close enough to seem touchable, the Upper Peninsula waits. 4 miles away, hours away. Over 34 years, those ferries carried something close to 12 million vehicles and more than 30 million passengers. For many of those 30 million people, standing on that deck was the only time in their entire lives they ever traveled aboard a ship. That's not a footnote. For millions of Midwestern families, this ordinary, maddening errand was also, quietly, the closest thing they ever had to an ocean voyage. Heard today, it sounds almost charming. Memory turns, waiting into atmosphere. But a family with restless children and 100 miles still to drive did not experience the gulls as picturesque, and hunters who sat through the night in freezing cars. During the worst crushes, waits could swallow most of a day, with one period account putting an extreme backup at 19 hours, were not making memories. They were losing vacation. The maddening part is that the very inconvenience Americans were desperate to eliminate is precisely what later generations would remember most fondly. It was a world, and it had become intolerable. Michigan responded by building the greatest ferry it had ever put on the Straits. Vacation Land arrived in the early 1950s, powerful, ice-breaking, purpose-built, able to swallow around 150 vehicles at once, with engines at both ends to fight through winter flows. She was the state's final attempt to prove that boats could still keep pace with the automobile. They couldn't. The lines kept growing anyway. By the time Vacation Land arrived, Michigan's newest ferry was already competing with a bridge that didn't yet exist. One man's career spans nearly the whole of that vanished fleet. Mickey Sweeney worked all 10 ferries used in the state operation, every boat, every era of the system, and worked his way up to captain of the Vacation Land herself, the boat his son would later call the Queen of the Fleet. Sweeney's career had followed the ferry system from its smallest boats to its most powerful vessel. What no captain could outrun was the automobile age itself. By now, everyone understood what the real answer had to be. The trouble was that Michigan had already tried to build it once, and history had said no. The bridge that almost was. The strangest thing about Mackinac's 70-year struggle is that Michigan actually started building the bridge, and then left the beginning of it sitting uselessly in the water for 16 years. In the 1930s, the dream finally began to behave like a project. The state created a bridge authority. Engineers took borings from the bottom of the Straits to learn what the bedrock would hold. Surveys settled on the route every driver knows today, straight across the Narrows, Mackinac City to St. Ignace. And then Michigan did something irreversible. It started building. From the St. Ignace shore, a causeway of rock and fill pushed out into the Straits, solid ground where there had been open water, the first physical piece of a crossing people had been sketching since the 1880s. Then, on a Sunday morning in December 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the country's steel, money, and men had somewhere else to be. The project didn't fail. It simply stopped, the way a clock stops. And for 16 years, the unfinished causeway sat in the Straits, a road that ran out of land and pointed at nothing, aimed across 4 miles of water at a bridge that didn't exist. For 16 years, travelers waiting for ferries could literally look at the abandoned beginning of the future that was supposed to replace them. Some of the people who had heard the bridge promised in their childhood were now hearing it promised to their grandchildren. And after the war, the automobile made the old dream unavoidable. Post-war America bought cars at a rate no one had imagined, aimed a remarkable number of them north on summer mornings, and funneled them all into the same handful of boats. The absurd old dream had stopped being optional, but making the bridge necessary turned out to be much easier than making it possible. Prentice Brown and the price tag. One of the men who eventually forced the Mackinac Bridge into existence had already learned, personally, exactly how vicious these 4 miles could be. Decades before the bridge was built, a 30-year-old St. Ignace lawyer named Prentice M. Brown needed to reach Lansing for a state Supreme Court case. The ferries were locked in ice and going nowhere. So Brown and another traveler hired a horse and a cutter and set out to cross the frozen straits themselves, 4 miles on ice in winter, because a boat wasn't an option. They found ice hummocks taller than a man, some reportedly 10 feet high, heaved up where the plates had crushed together and refrozen. At some point the ice grew too broken and uncertain for the horse, so they sent the animal back the way it came and kept going on foot into the wind, through blowing snow, picking their way around a stretch of open water nearly 50 acres wide that the cold hadn't managed to seal. No boat, no horse, just 2 men navigating cracked ice by daylight, hoping the next hummock held their weight. It took most of the day. They missed the train anyway. Brown said later that the crossing stayed with him. Years later, the man defeated by the Straits would become the chairman charged with defeating them permanently. In 1950, Michigan created a new Mackinac Bridge Authority and put Brown in charge of it. Where 70 years of committees had produced drawings, Brown's authority was designed to produce a bridge. By 1951, engineers had delivered the feasibility report. It could be done. After decades of the question, can we build it? The experts had finally answered yes. After 70 years, engineers had finally solved the bridge. Wall Street almost killed it instead. The bridge would be financed not by taxes, but by revenue bonds, investors lending the money up front to be repaid by tolls from drivers who didn't exist yet, crossing a bridge that hadn't been built over water, famous for destroying things. The Korean War tightened steel and squeezed the timeline, and when the bonds first went to market, the market said no. Michigan found itself holding a fully engineered, fully approved bridge that nobody would pay for. A strange defeat. Vanderbilt couldn't will this bridge into being. The Depression couldn't fund it. A world war had frozen it. Now, with the engineering finally proven, it nearly died in a bond office, beaten not by wind or water or war, but by interest rates. It took until late 1953. The market steadied, the terms were sweetened, and when the sale finally closed, almost $100 million had been raised. 70 years of dreaming had just become a construction schedule with a start date. It needed something else now. It needed a designer who understood exactly how a bridge like this could die. Steinman and the Ghost of Tacoma Narrows. David Steinman wasn't being asked merely to design a very long bridge. He was being asked to prove that a giant suspension bridge could survive the kind of aerodynamic forces that had just destroyed one of America's newest spans. The son of immigrants, raised in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge on New York's Lower East Side, Steinman had already designed hundreds of bridges around the world. But to understand the choices he made at Mackinac, you have to watch a different bridge fall down. In November 1940, in Washington State, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, slender, elegant, 4 months old, began to twist in a 40-mile-per-hour wind. Its roadway rippled like a shaken bedsheet, heaved, corkscrewed, and tore itself apart while cameras rolled. The footage became the most famous engineering failure film ever made. Every bridge designer alive watched a modern suspension span destroy itself in a wind that wasn't even a storm. Now consider where Michigan proposed to hang its bridge, a wind funnel between 2 of the largest lakes on Earth, in a place of November gales, winter ice, and open water in every direction. Mackinac became the first long-span suspension bridge built with a specific collection of features designed to manage exactly those aerodynamic forces. deep, open stiffening trusses beneath the roadway and down the center lanes, a porous steel grid instead of solid pavement, so that wind could pass through the deck instead of pushing against it. This wasn't merely another large suspension bridge. It represented a new generation of them. Engineers today still point to Mackinac as a landmark in aerodynamic suspension bridge design, and Steinman's strangest solution would eventually produce a bridge designed to do something that sounds terrifying until you understand it: move. On paper, the design was so stable it was almost overbuilt. But paper was the easy part. In the spring of 1954, the theoretical bridge had to do the one thing no drawing can do. It had to stand up in the water. May 1954, the dream turns industrial. To build Mackinac, contractors assembled the largest bridge construction fleet ever gathered for a single project. Derricks, pile drivers, tugs, floating cranes, cement plants, survey towers rising straight out of open water. Roughly 3,500 men worked the bridge site itself, with another 7,500 at the quarries, shops, and mills that supplied it. Imagine boarding an ordinary state ferry and finding an industrial city floating across the straits around you. That was the ferry passenger's view in the summer of 1954. Before engineers could build one of the world's great suspension bridges, they first had to manufacture pieces of dry land in the middle of the Great Lakes. Enormous steel cylinders, some 116 feet across, a donut scaled for Paul Bunyan, were floated into position, sunk through mud and clay to bedrock, then pumped out and filled solid with stone and concrete in places more than 200 feet down. One by one, the Straits gained a row of artificial stone islands running from shore to shore. And once those foundations reached bedrock, Mackinac stopped being a promise. It started climbing into the sky. The bridgeman. Then the bridge passed from engineers on paper to men willing to work 500 feet over open water. Iron workers, divers, riggers, operators. They came from across the country, many of them veterans of other great spans, and they did their work in places that look, in the photographs, frankly impossible. Men strolling along a top cord of steel 500 feet over open water, hands in pockets. Men riding loads skyward on cables. Men on swaying catwalks in the wind, connected to the world below by nothing but a telephone line to an operator they couldn't see. When winter closed in, the Straits shut the whole enterprise down, and the ironworkers scattered to wait for spring like everyone else. For all the language about engineering triumph, Mackinac demanded a human price. 5 men died building the Mackinac Bridge: Frank Pepper, James R. Lesarge, Albert Abbott, Jack C. Baker, Robert Coppin. One died in a diving accident deep beneath the Straits. Others fell, 2 of them plunging some 550 feet from a temporary catwalk near the North Tower. One of the bodies was never recovered from the water. A legend grew up afterward, the kind that attaches itself to every great concrete structure, that somewhere inside the bridge's piers, workers lie entombed where they fell, sealed in forever. People still repeat it. It isn't true, and the Bridge Authority itself says so plainly. No one is buried in the Mackinac Bridge. 5 men simply went to work on it one morning and didn't come home. The truth needs no embellishment. The towers and the cables. By the time the towers began rising, Michigan wasn't simply building a connection anymore. It was assembling what would become the longest suspension bridge between anchorages on Earth, a title it held for decades. And nearly 7 decades later, Mackinac is still the longest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere when measured by total suspended length. The 2 main towers rose 552 feet above the water. Stand the Washington Monument in the Straits, and it would come up short. Each tower went up section by riveted section, raised by creeper derricks, hoisting rigs that jacked themselves upward on the very steel they had just erected, inching skyward like mechanical caterpillars. The machine that built the tower had to climb the tower it was building. From the highway, each main cable looks like one enormous piece of steel. It isn't. Workers strung catwalks of wire and plank between the towers, sagging in the exact curve the finished cables would take, and along them, month after month, spinning wheels shuttled back and forth, trailing wire no thicker than a pencil, pass after pass, roughly 12,000 tons of it, squeezed at last into two cables as thick as tree trunks. Tens of thousands of individual wires, placed one at a time by men standing in the wind hundreds of feet over the Straits. And all of this had to happen on a schedule controlled not by engineers, but by winter. The entire project lived inside a race that reset every spring. Whatever wasn't finished by November would stand exposed in the gales until April, another season, another year of interest on $100 million borrowed dollars, another year of ferry lines below. By the end of the 1955 season, the tower stood complete against the northern sky. And that winter, with construction frozen and the steel silent, the Straits produced the strangest scene in this entire story. Winter at the Straits, the old world beneath the new. Then, for a one extraordinary winter, Americans could sit inside the travel world Mackinac was about to destroy and look directly at its replacement. November came, and with it, deer season. And the hunters came north exactly as they had for 30 years, thousands of them, funneling into Mackinac City, joining the line for the ferries. The line was the same as it had always been. The cold cars, the pasties passed through rolled-down windows, the gulls, the horn out on the water, the slow shuffle toward the dock. Only one thing was different. Now the waiting men could look up. Above them, out over the Straits, stood two towers of silent steel, 550 feet tall, dusted with snow, with catwalks slung between them. The unmistakable skeleton of the thing that was going to end all of this. A hunter could sit in a frozen automobile at 2 in the morning, third hour in line, engine idling to keep the heater alive, and see through his windshield the exact shape of the future, a bridge, half-born, hanging in the winter dark. For one final stretch of Michigan history, the old crossing and the new one existed side by side. The ferry line waited underneath its own replacement. Whether they realized it or not, they were doing something Americans would soon never have to do again. That is what the end of an ERA actually looks like. Not a ceremony, a line of taillights in the snow beneath an unfinished silhouette. The roadway that had to breathe. The strangest part of Mackinac is something millions of drivers have felt beneath their own tires. Through 1956 and into 1957, the deck went up, steel sections hoisted from barges and hung from the cables one after another, the gaps closing until, for the first time since the glaciers, you could travel from one Michigan to the other without touching water. And into the center lanes of that deck went Steinman's strangest idea, an open steel grid instead of solid pavement. Drivers would notice it immediately and forever, the hum rising through the tires, the glimpse of water flickering past beneath the car. This open roadway was part of what made Mackinac a landmark in suspension bridge design. Instead of presenting the wind with a solid surface to attack, much of the structure lets the air pass straight through. That's the Tacoma Narrows lesson, built into the floor. And here is the part that sounds wrong until you understand suspension bridges. Mackinac's center span was designed to move as much as 35 feet east or west in severe winds, not twist itself apart, move 35 feet. The bridge survived severe conditions partly because it was never designed to behave like a rigid wall. Under sustained wind, the suspended span can slowly deflect rather than dangerously twisting the way Tacoma did. Watching the deck close was its own quiet drama. Suspended spans do something that unnerves people seeing it for the first time. The steel doesn't line up. Sections hang from the cables at odd angles, refusing to meet, because a suspension bridge only settles into its true shape as weight comes onto it. So through 1957, piece by piece, the crooked bridge slowly relaxed into a straight one. The gaps kissed shut, and riveting crews sealed a roadway into the sky. And the whole time, the ferries kept running directly below. In 1957, passengers could ride one transportation system while watching its replacement being painted directly above them. Every span that closed overhead moved the ferry system's expiration date closer. By the autumn of 1957, the bridge was painted, lit, and finished. Out on the water, the ferries kept running their routes right on time. They had weeks left to exist. November 1st, 1957, the day one world ended. On November 1st, 1957, 34 years of state ferry travel became obsolete in a single morning. The morning it opened, cars lined up on both shores nearly a mile deep, the same kind of line that had formed for the ferries 1,000 times before. Except this time, nobody was waiting for a boat. An official party crossed first. Dozens of cars and buses, trailed by reporters who had come from across the country to watch a bridge open. Then the toll gates lifted, and ordinary traffic simply began moving, one car after another, off the end of the lower peninsula and onto 5 miles of steel that had not existed the week before. Over the previous 34 years, the ferries had carried roughly 12 million vehicles and more than 30 million passengers. That morning, their job effectively disappeared. For the first time, a motorist could drive from southern Michigan into the Upper Peninsula without surrendering the trip to a ferry timetable, a loading ramp, winter ice, or a peak season queue. The Upper Peninsula had gone from a place motorists had to board a ship to reach into part of one continuous road trip. The highway no longer ended at the water. 3 things were true at once that morning. For the state of Michigan, it was victory, the 70-year problem solved. For the traveler, it was liberation, the weight abolished. And for the ferry world of docks and horns and pasties and gulls, it was extinction. Same day, same 4 miles of water. The boats themselves scattered the way retired ships do. The most advanced ferry Michigan had ever built survived its own route by only a few years. The mighty vacation land, pride of the Straits, for barely 6 years, passed through other owners and other names and ended far from Michigan. In 1987, while being towed across the Pacific, she sank. The bridge stayed home. The ships that once defined the crossing are gone from the Straits entirely. The state of Michigan expected the bridge to solve a traffic problem. It did. What nobody quite predicted was what it became next. The obstacle becomes the attraction. Michigan spent 70 years trying to make the Straits disappear from the journey. Instead, it accidentally created one of the most memorable moments of the journey. Within a year of opening, it was being celebrated as a boon to the tourists of northern Michigan, not merely a faster way to reach the Upper Peninsula, but a reason to go. Postcards, viewpoints, souvenirs, the mighty Mac. The thing designed to erase an obstacle had turned the crossing into a destination. And for the families of the Midwest, it slid into a role no engineer had drawn. It became part of the vacation itself. Through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the station wagons, the campers, the coolers wedged between kids in the back seat, the trip up north acquired a new landmark ritual. Hours of farmland and pine, the radio fading in and out, and then ahead over the trees, the towers. Green steel against the sky. For millions of children in the back seats of those cars, the Mackinac Bridge was the moment the drive stopped being a drive and started being vacation. The rituals accumulated on their own, the way rituals do. Fathers announcing the bridge a mile before it appeared. Kids competing to spot the towers first. The held breath at the top of the center span, 200 feet up, with Lake Michigan spreading away on one side and Lake Huron on the other. The nervous joke about the grating. The stop for fudge on the far side. That may be Mackinac's strangest achievement. A piece of infrastructure became a childhood milestone. People didn't merely remember where the bridge took them, they remembered crossing it. The bridge did not eliminate the ritual of crossing the Straits. It replaced it. One generation remembered a shipdeck, gulls, and pasties, for some of them the only voyage of their life. The next generation remembered green towers rising ahead of them and the hum of the grating under the tires. Different rituals, same 4 miles. The structure, built because Americans were tired of crossing too slowly, eventually became so beloved that tens of thousands now gather to cross it on foot. Beginning in 1958, once a year, the bridge does the one thing it was never built to do. It slows down. On Labor Day morning, the bridge walk fills the span with pedestrians, a Michigan institution now generations old. And yet, the Straits were never entirely conquered. Even today, the bridge is impressive enough to intimidate people who have crossed countless ordinary bridges without a second thought. The wind Steinman designed against still comes funneling between the lakes. Storms still close lanes. Gales can still halt crossings altogether. And every year, thousands of drivers reach the foot of the bridge and discover they cannot make themselves drive it. The height, the openness, the water flickering through the grid. The Bridge Authority quietly runs a service for exactly this. Call ahead, and someone will drive your car across for you while you close your eyes in the passenger seat. 60-plus years of engineering triumph, and the Straits of Mackinac can still make a grown adult hand over the keys. The geography never stopped being formidable. The bridge did not defeat the water. It negotiated with it. The man who kept the builders from disappearing. Eventually, Mackinac faced a different kind of disappearance. The bridge remained extraordinary. The people who built it were becoming history. J.C. Stillwell had worked the bridge as an ironworker in the 1950s. He later opened a restaurant in Mackinac City called Mamma Mia's, and above it built a small museum of the trade, hard hats, tools, photographs of ironworkers grinning on beams in the sky because he wanted the men and their work remembered. In 2005, a fire tore through the building, destroying irreplaceable pieces of the collection. The museum was rebuilt with donated artifacts, and it stands today, memory twice salvaged, first from time, then from fire. The men aged. Steinman died. Brown died. The ferry captains disappeared. The structure they fought over remained, still carrying traffic across what had once been one of the most stubborn barriers in American road travel. The bridge has outlasted its bonds, its builders, its designer, its skeptics, and the entire transportation system it replaced. In June of 2022, the Bridge Authority logged its 200 millionth crossing. A family from Tawas City headed to Pictured Rocks for their kid's first big hike, who didn't even realize what they'd done until officials flagged them down on the far side with a framed print and a gift basket. No line, no horn, no wait. Just a toll, a climb, 10 minutes, and the Upper Peninsula. Their kids had no idea their great-grandparents might have spent hours beside this same water, watching gulls, waiting for a boat. The 4 miles stand at the Straits today and take inventory of this whole story. The 1884 newspaper dream, the floating tunnel, and the 24-mile island-hopping fantasy. Vanderbilt on the Grand Hotel porch, the little Ariel and the ferry lines, and the pasties sold car to car. Mickey Sweeney, who worked every boat in that fleet. The causeway that pointed at nothing for 16 years. Brown, crossing the frozen straits on foot. Steinman, who never stopped thinking about wind. The bridgemen on their catwalks. Pepper, Lesarge, Abbott, Baker, Coppin. The hunters idling in the snow beneath the half-built towers. The morning the ferry stopped. All of it gone now, except the one thing all of it was about. That is what makes Mackinac more than a beautiful bridge. It solved a transportation problem that had frustrated Michigan for generations, became a landmark in the science of suspension bridges, erased an entire ferry system in a single morning, and then somehow became as important to the memory of going north as the ferries it replaced. The 4 miles of water are still there. The wind still comes across the lakes the way it did when it frightened engineers, and the water that once stopped every automobile bound for the North Country still moves, cold and green, exactly where it always has. The geography of the Straits of Mackinac never changed at all. What changed was U.S. What disappeared was the weight. A grandparent remembers a ship deck, the gulls, the pasties. A grandchild remembers green towers, open grating, the first glimpse of the water below. Different rituals, same 4 miles. And maybe that's why this bridge became something more than a shortcut, why it gets walked and photographed and painted on the walls of Michigan classrooms. It isn't just steel over water. It's the line between 2 eras of American travel. On one side, a journey that stopped at the water's edge. On the other, a road that doesn't end. The bridge, the water, the cars moving.